The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Windsor Castle, as Sergeant Major William Hayes adjusted his red tunic for what he believed would be another ordinary day of royal duty. With 23 years of faithful service to the crown, Hayes had become as much a fixture of the royal household as the ancient stones that formed the castle walls. His weathered hands, scarred from years of military service before joining the Royal Protection Detail, smoothed down his uniform with practiced precision. At 62 years old, Hayes carried himself with the rigid posture that decades of military discipline had carved into his very bones. His steel-gray hair was trimmed to regulation length, and his boots gleamed with the kind of shine that could only come from countless hours of careful maintenance. The other guards often joked that Hayes could polish his boots in complete darkness and still achieve a mirror finish. Prince George, now 11 years old, had grown accustomed to seeing Hayes stationed outside his private study every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. The young prince had recently begun taking advanced mathematics lessons with his private tutor, Mr. Richardson, a brilliant but somewhat stern academic who had been handpicked by his parents. These sessions were considered crucial for George's education, as he showed remarkable aptitude for numbers and logical thinking. The relationship between Hayes and the young prince had always been professional, yet warm. Hayes remembered when George was just a toddler, barely able to walk steadily, yet always offering a shy smile when he passed by. Over the years, that shy smile had evolved into confident nods and occasional brief conversations about Hayes's military medals or the changing of the guard ceremonies. On this particular Tuesday, something felt different in the castle's atmosphere. The staff moved with an unusual urgency, and there were whispered conversations in corners that stopped abruptly when Hayes approached. He had learned to read the subtle signs of tension within the royal household, and today those signs were unmistakable. As Hayes took his position outside the study, he could hear the muffled voices of Prince George and Mr. Richardson through the heavy oak door. The mathematics lesson seemed to be proceeding normally, with the tutor's measured explanations punctuated by George's thoughtful questions. The young prince had inherited his father's analytical mind and his mother's determination to understand complex concepts thoroughly. Around midday, Hayes noticed an unusual commotion near the main entrance. Several black vehicles had arrived, and men in dark suits were making their way through the castle corridors with purposeful strides. These weren't the usual security personnel that Hayes knew by sight. Their movement suggested they were conducting some form of official business, though Hayes couldn't determine the exact nature of their visit. The mathematics lesson concluded precisely at 1 o'clock. As scheduled, Mr. Richardson emerged from the study, carrying his leather briefcase and wearing an expression that Hayes couldn't quite interpret. The tutor offered a brief nod to Hayes before hurrying down the corridor, his footsteps echoing against the stone floors with unusual haste. Prince George appeared in the doorway moments later, but instead of heading directly to lunch as was his custom, he remained standing there, studying Hayes with an intensity that the sergeant major had never experienced before. The young prince's blue eyes, so remarkably similar to his father's, seemed to be weighing something of considerable importance. "Sergeant Major Hayes," George said quietly, his voice carrying a gravity that seemed far beyond his 11 years. "Might I have a word with you?" Hayes straightened to attention, surprised by the formal tone. Throughout their years of acquaintance, Prince George had always been polite but casual in their interactions. This sudden shift to formality suggested that something significant was about to occur. "Of course, Your Royal Highness," Hayes replied, maintaining his professional demeanor while internally wondering what could prompt such an unusual request from the young prince. George stepped back into the study and gestured for Hayes to follow. The room was filled with afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows that overlooked the castle's east garden. Mathematical equations and geometric diagrams still covered the whiteboard from the morning's lesson, and textbooks lay open on the polished mahogany desk. The young prince moved to stand behind the desk, unconsciously adopting a posture that mirrored the formal stance Hayes had seen Prince William take during official ceremonies. Despite his youth, George possessed a natural authority that spoke to his royal heritage and the careful grooming he had received since birth. "I need to discuss something with you that requires complete confidentiality," George began, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of concern. "What I'm about to share cannot leave this room. and I need your word as both a soldier and a gentleman that you'll honor that request." Hayes felt a chill run down his spine. In all his years of service, he had never been addressed in such a manner by any member of the royal family, let alone by the young prince. The gravity in George's voice suggested that whatever was about to be revealed would have serious implications. "You have my word, Your Royal Highness," Hayes responded, his military training keeping his voice steady despite the growing unease he felt. George moved to the window and gazed out at the gardens where he had played as a younger child. His small frame was silhouetted against the bright afternoon light, creating an image that somehow captured both his youth and the weight of responsibility that would one day rest upon his shoulders. "There are things happening in this castle that concern me deeply," George said without turning around. "Things that involve people I care about, people who have served my family with loyalty and dedication for many years." The young prince paused, seeming to gather his thoughts before continuing. Hayes remained silent, sensing that George needed time to find the right words for whatever revelation was coming. "I've learned something today that will change everything," George finally said, turning back to face Hayes. "And I believe you deserve to know the truth before others make decisions that will affect your life without your knowledge or consent." Hayes felt his heart rate increase as Prince George's words hung in the air between them. The afternoon sunlight seemed to dim slightly, as if clouds were gathering outside the tall windows. The sergeant major had faced enemy fire in 3 different conflicts during his military career, but the quiet intensity in the 11-year-old prince's voice created a different kind of tension entirely. "Your Royal Highness," Hayes began carefully, "if there's something troubling you, perhaps it would be better discussed with your parents or—" "No," George interrupted gently but firmly. "This involves my parents' advisors, and they don't know what I've discovered. They can't know, at least not yet." The young prince moved away from the window and sat down in the leather chair behind the desk. Despite his small stature, he managed to project an air of authority that reminded Hayes of the late Queen Elizabeth during her most serious moments. It was remarkable how royal bearing could manifest even in someone so young. "During my mathematics lesson today, Mr. Richardson received a phone call," George continued. "He thought I was focused on my equations, but I heard parts of his conversation. He was speaking with someone about security clearances and background investigations." Hayes maintained his composure, but internally, he felt a growing sense of dread. Background investigations typically meant one of 2 things in his experience. Either someone was being considered for a promotion to a higher security level, or someone was being investigated for potential security violations. The conversation lasted several minutes, George said, his young face showing a maturity that seemed far beyond his years. "Mr. Richardson kept looking at me nervously, and I could tell he was trying to keep his voice low. But I heard your name mentioned multiple times, along with phrases like immediate concern and potential compromise." The words hit Hayes like a physical blow. In 23 years of service, his loyalty had never been questioned. He had undergone routine security reviews, as all royal protection staff did, and had always passed without incident. The suggestion that he might be considered a security risk felt like a betrayal of everything he had dedicated his adult life to. "I don't understand," Hayes said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've never done anything that could be construed as—" "I know," George said quickly. "That's exactly why I wanted to speak with you first. Whatever they think they've found, I wanted you to hear it from someone who knows your character." The young prince stood up and walked around the desk to stand directly in front of Hayes. Despite the significant difference in their heights, George's presence filled the room with an authority that demanded attention and respect. "Mr. Richardson mentioned something about your son," George continued, his voice gentle but clear. "Apparently there have been some concerns raised about David's recent activities and associations." Hayes felt the blood drain from his face. His son David, 28 years old and working as a journalist for a mid-tier London newspaper, had always been something of a free spirit. David had inherited his mother's artistic temperament and his father's stubborn streak, creating a personality that sometimes led him into controversial situations. "What kind of concerns?" Hayes asked, though he dreaded the answer. "From what I could gather, David has been investigating some story involving government contracts and military suppliers," George explained. Apparently, his research has brought him into contact with some individuals who are considered security risks by the intelligence services. The pieces began falling into place in Hayes's mind. David had mentioned working on an expose about defense contractors overcharging the government for military equipment. It was exactly the kind of investigative journalism that David was passionate about, but Hayes had warned him to be careful about the sources he contacted and the methods he used to gather information. The concern seems to be that David's activities could potentially compromise your security clearance, George continued, not because you're involved in anything improper, but because family members with questionable associations can be used as leverage against security personnel. Hayes closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The irony was bitter. His son's dedication to exposing corruption could end up destroying Hayes's career and reputation. After decades of faithful service, he might be forced out not because of his own actions, but because of his family connections. There's more, George said quietly. I heard Mr. Richardson mention that a decision has already been made. They're planning to transfer you to a different position, away from direct royal protection duties. The words felt like a death sentence to Hayes. Royal protection duty wasn't just his job. It was his identity, his purpose, his life's work. Being transferred to a lesser position would essentially mean the end of his career, in any meaningful sense. At 62, with limited options for reinventing himself professionally, such a transfer would likely force him into early retirement. When? Hayes asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. Tomorrow morning, George replied. They're planning to present it as a routine reassignment, with a commendation for your years of service. But we both know what it really means. Hayes stared at the young prince, amazed by the compassion and wisdom he saw in those young eyes. George could have simply ignored the overheard conversation, or mentioned it casually to his parents. Instead, he had chosen to take on the burden of delivering this devastating news personally, showing a level of consideration that spoke volumes about his character. Why are you telling me this? Hayes asked. You could have pretended you never heard anything. George looked directly into Hayes's eyes with an intensity that was remarkable for someone so young. Because you've spent your entire adult life protecting my family. You've stood guard over us, watched over us, and served us with complete loyalty. You deserve better than to be blindsided by bureaucrats who see you as nothing more than a potential security risk. The young prince paused, seeming to gather his thoughts before continuing with what Hayes sensed would be the most important part of their conversation. And because I've been thinking about what kind of man I want to be when I grow up, George added quietly, I want to be the kind of person who stands up for people who have stood up for us. The silence that followed Prince George's words was filled with the weight of decisions that would change lives forever. Hayes stood perfectly still, his military training keeping him upright despite feeling as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet. The young prince remained standing before him, shoulders squared with a determination that seemed to grow stronger by the moment. Your Royal Highness, Hayes began, his voice thick with emotion. I appreciate your thoughtfulness in telling me this, but there's nothing that can be done. If the security services have made their decision, that's where you're wrong, George interrupted, his voice carrying a quiet authority that stopped Hayes mid-sentence. There's always something that can be done. My father taught me that the most important decisions are often the ones that seem impossible to make. George walked back to the window, but this time he didn't turn away from Hayes. Instead, he gestured for the sergeant major to join him. Together, they looked out at the gardens where groundskeepers were tending to the late autumn flowers, their movements precise and purposeful. Do you see those men working in the garden? George asked. Some of them have been here for 30 years or more. They've dedicated their lives to maintaining something beautiful for my family. Would it be right to dismiss them because their children made choices that someone else disapproved of? Hayes understood the parallel George was drawing, but he also understood the realities of security protocol. The situations are different, Your Royal Highness. Garden staff don't have access to sensitive information or responsibility for family safety, aren't they? George challenged, turning to face Hayes directly. Those gardeners know the layout of every path, every hidden corner, every entrance and exit. They know our routines, our habits, our favorite places to walk. If someone wanted to harm my family, wouldn't those gardeners be just as valuable as targets for pressure or bribery? The logic was sound, and Hayes found himself impressed once again by the young prince's analytical thinking. George had inherited more than just his father's appearance. He had also inherited the ability to see complex situations from multiple angles. The point is, George continued, security isn't just about eliminating every possible risk. It's about understanding which risks are real and which are imaginary. It's about recognizing the difference between someone who might become a threat and someone who has proven their loyalty through decades of faithful service. Hayes felt a stirring of hope despite his better judgment. The young prince's words made sense, but changing the minds of security officials and government bureaucrats was far more complicated than logical arguments could address. "What are you proposing?" Hayes asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. George moved to the desk and picked up a piece of paper that had been lying beneath his mathematics textbook. It was official-looking stationery bearing the royal crest, and Hayes could see that something had been written on it in George's careful handwriting. "I've written a letter," George said simply, "a formal request that your case be reviewed by my father personally before any final decisions are made." Hayes stared at the paper in the young prince's hands, hardly believing what he was hearing. The idea that an 11-year-old would take such a step to protect a member of the household staff was unprecedented in Hayes's experience. "Your Royal Highness," Hayes said carefully, "I'm deeply honored by your concern, but this kind of intervention could create problems for you with your parents and their advisors." "You shouldn't risk your own position for what?" George interrupted. "For doing what's right. For standing up for someone who has stood up for us. My position isn't something I earned, Sergeant Major Hayes. It's something I was born into. That makes it my responsibility to use it wisely." The young prince held out the letter, but Hayes hesitated to take it. Accepting George's help would mean allowing a child to fight a battle that belonged to the adult world. Yet refusing it might mean losing not just his career, but also the chance to clear his name and protect his family's reputation. "Read it," George said gently, pressing the letter into Hayes's hands. With trembling fingers, Hayes unfolded the paper and began to read. The letter was formally structured yet written in language that was unmistakably George's own voice. It outlined Hayes's years of service, his dedication to the royal family, and his exemplary record. But more than that, it made a compelling argument about the principles of fairness and loyalty that should guide decisions about long-serving staff members. "I've also included a suggestion," George said as Hayes continued reading. "Rather than transferring you immediately, I've proposed that you be given the opportunity to address the concerns directly. If your son's activities are the issue, then perhaps there's a way to resolve that issue without ending your career." Hayes looked up from the letter, amazed by the thoughtfulness and maturity evident in every line. The young prince had not only identified the problem and its implications, but had also proposed a constructive solution that addressed everyone's concerns. "This is remarkable," Hayes said quietly. "But are you certain you want to involve yourself in this situation? Once you present this letter, there will be no going back." George's expression grew serious, and for a moment, Hayes could see the future king that the boy would one day become. There was steel in his young spine and fire in his blue eyes that spoke of courage inherited from generations of monarchs who had faced far greater challenges. "Sergeant Major Hayes," George said formally, "you've spent 23 years proving your loyalty to my family. Now it's time for my family to prove our loyalty to you." The young prince walked to the desk and picked up a small brass bell that was used to summon staff when needed. Hayes realized that George was preparing to set events in motion that could not be undone. "I'm going to ring for my private secretary," George said. "She'll arrange for this letter to be delivered to my father immediately. But before I do that, I need to ask you something." Hayes straightened to attention, sensing that this moment would define not just his own future, but also his relationship with the young prince for years to come. "Are you prepared to fight for your position?" George asked. "Are you prepared to stand up and defend yourself not just for your own sake, but for the sake of everyone else who serves this family faithfully?" The question hit Hayes with unexpected force. Throughout his military career and his years of royal service, he had always followed orders without question. The idea of actively fighting against a decision made by his superiors felt foreign and frightening. Yet looking into George's determined young face, Hayes realized that sometimes the most important battles were the ones that required the greatest courage to begin. Hayes felt something shift deep within his chest as he looked into Prince George's expectant eyes. For 23 years, he had been a soldier first and foremost, following orders without question and accepting decisions made by those above him in the chain of command. But now, faced with an 11-year-old prince who was willing to risk his own standing to defend a servant's honor, Hayes discovered reserves of courage he hadn't known still existed. "Yes," he said quietly, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Yes, Your Royal Highness. I am prepared to fight." George's face lit up with a smile that transformed his serious expression into something bright and determined. Without hesitation, he reached for the brass bell and rang it twice, the signal for his private secretary to attend him immediately. Within moments, Mrs. Catherine Thornberry appeared at the study door. A woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked hair and the efficient manner of someone who had spent decades managing royal schedules. She took in the scene with professional calm, though Hayes noticed her eyebrows rise slightly at the unusual sight of him standing inside the prince's private study. "Your Royal Highness?" she inquired, stepping into the room and closing the door behind her. "Mrs. Thornberry," George said, his voice taking on the formal tone he used for official business. "I need you to arrange for an immediate private audience with my father. It's a matter of considerable urgency." Mrs. Thornberry glanced between George and Hayes, her experienced eyes reading the tension in the room with practiced ease. "Of course, Your Royal Highness. Might I ask the nature of the urgent matter?" George held up the letter he had written, its royal letterhead clearly visible. "I have a formal petition regarding the treatment of loyal household staff that requires my father's immediate attention. The matter involves decisions that are scheduled to be implemented tomorrow morning." The gravity in George's voice was unmistakable, and Mrs. Thornberry's expression shifted from routine efficiency to genuine concern. In her years of service, she had rarely seen the young prince display such serious determination about anything outside his studies. "I'll contact His Royal Highness's office immediately," she said. "However, I should mention that his schedule this afternoon is quite full. There are meetings with—" "Mrs. Thornberry," George interrupted gently but firmly, "with all due respect to my father's other obligations, this matter cannot wait until tomorrow. By then, an irreversible injustice will have been committed against a man who has served our family with complete loyalty for over 2 decades." Hayes watched in amazement as the young prince navigated the conversation with a skill that would have been impressive in an adult diplomat. George was not demanding or imperious. Instead, he was appealing to Mrs. Thornberry's sense of justice while making clear that he would not be deterred from his purpose. Mrs. Thornberry studied George's face for a long moment, then nodded decisively. "I'll see what can be arranged, Your Royal Highness. In the meantime, might I suggest that you and Sergeant Major Hayes remain here while I make the necessary calls?" After Mrs. Thornberry left to make arrangements, George turned back to Hayes with an expression that mixed determination with barely contained nervous energy. "Now we wait," he said simply. The next hour passed with agonizing slowness. George attempted to distract himself by reviewing his mathematics homework, but Hayes could see that the young prince's mind was elsewhere. Several times George started to speak, then stopped himself, as if unsure whether his thoughts were appropriate to share with a member of the household staff. Finally, George set down his pencil and looked directly at Hayes. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Of course, Your Royal Highness." "Do you ever regret choosing this life?" George asked. "I mean, you could have had any number of careers after your military service. You could have earned more money, had more freedom, lived a more normal life. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had made different choices?" The question caught Hayes off guard with its maturity and insight. He considered his response carefully, understanding that his answer might influence how the young prince viewed service and duty in his own life. "There have been moments," Hayes admitted honestly, "when I've wondered about the path not taken. But regret? No, Your Royal Highness. This work has given my life meaning and purpose in ways that money or freedom never could have." George nodded thoughtfully. "Even now? Even facing the possibility that it might all end because of circumstances beyond your control?" "Especially now," Hayes replied, "because this situation has shown me that the values we've tried to uphold, loyalty, honor, justice, still matter to people who will shape the future. That gives me hope." Before George could respond, a soft knock at the door announced Mrs. Thornberry's return. She entered with the expression that managed to convey both success and apprehension. "Your Royal Highness," she said. "His Royal Highness will see you in his private office in 15 minutes. However, I should warn you that he was quite surprised by the urgency of your request, and he has several questions about the nature of this matter." George stood up immediately, straightening his clothes and smoothing his hair with the automatic gestures of someone trained from birth for formal occasions. "Thank you, Mrs. Thornberry. That will be sufficient time." As Mrs. Thornberry left again, George turned to Hayes with a mixture of determination and uncertainty. "I want you to come with me," he said. "This concerns you directly, and you should be present to speak for yourself." Hayes felt his heart rate increase dramatically. The prospect of being part of a formal audience with Prince William, especially under these circumstances, was both terrifying and surreal. "Your Royal Highness, I'm not sure that's appropriate. This is a family matter now, and—" "No," George said firmly. "This is a matter of justice, and justice requires that all voices be heard. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "you said you were prepared to fight for your position. Well, this is what fighting looks like." As they prepared to leave the study, George paused at the door and looked back at Hayes with an expression that seemed far older than his 11 years. "Sergeant Major Hayes, regardless of what happens in my father's office, I want you to know that you've taught me something important today." "What's that, Your Royal Highness?" "You've taught me that true loyalty isn't just about following orders or maintaining traditions. It's about recognizing when something is wrong and having the courage to stand up for what's right, even when the cost might be high." George opened the door and stepped into the corridor, his young shoulders squared with determination. Hayes followed, understanding that they were walking toward a confrontation that would determine not just his own future, but also help shape the character of a future king who was already showing signs of the wisdom and courage that would be required to lead a nation. The walk through the castle corridors to Prince William's private office felt like a journey through Hayes's entire career. Each familiar painting, each polished banister, each ancient stone archway held memories of years spent protecting and serving the royal family. Now those same corridors might be witnessing his final moments as a member of the royal household staff. Prince George walked beside him with purposeful strides, his young face set in an expression of calm determination that reminded Hayes remarkably of Queen Elizabeth during her most resolute moments. The boy had inherited more than just royal blood. He had inherited the ability to remain composed under pressure, a quality that would serve him well in the years to come. As they approached the heavy oak door marked with Prince William's personal coat of arms, George paused and turned to Hayes. "Whatever happens in there, remember that you've done nothing wrong. Sometimes good people face difficult situations through no fault of their own. That doesn't make them less worthy of respect and fair treatment." Mrs. Thornberry was waiting outside the office, and she knocked gently before opening the door to announce their arrival. "Your Royal Highness Prince George and Sergeant Major Hayes are here to see you." Prince William's voice carried through the doorway, formal but tinged with curiosity. "Please show them in." Hayes had been in Prince William's presence countless times over the years, but always in his capacity as a security officer, standing at attention and maintaining professional distance. Now, entering the private office as the subject of discussion rather than as a protector, he felt acutely aware of every detail of the richly appointed room. Prince William stood behind his mahogany desk, dressed in a navy suit that emphasized his tall frame and authoritative bearing. His expression was serious but not unkind, and Hayes could see both curiosity and concern in his eyes as he took in the unusual sight of his son, accompanied by a senior member of the household staff. "George," Prince William said, his voice carrying the tone of a father addressing his child, "Mrs. Thornberry tells me you have an urgent matter that requires my immediate attention. She also mentioned that it involves Sergeant Major Hayes directly." George stepped forward, and Hayes watched in amazement as the 11-year-old transformed before his eyes. The boy's posture straightened, his voice took on formal cadences, and his entire bearing shifted into what could only be described as regal authority. "Father," George began, using the formal address he reserved for official occasions, "I have discovered information about a decision that is scheduled to be implemented tomorrow morning regarding Sergeant Major Hayes. I believe this decision is being made without complete information and without proper consideration of all relevant factors." Prince William's eyebrows rose slightly, and Hayes could see him struggling to balance his roles as both a father dealing with his son's unexpected intervention and a senior royal being presented with what appeared to be a formal petition. "George," Prince William said carefully, "these matters are typically handled by security advisors and administrative staff. They're not usually appropriate subjects for, with respect, Father," George interrupted gently but firmly, "when a decision affects someone who has served our family faithfully for 23 years. I believe it becomes a matter that deserves the personal attention of the family he has protected." George held out the letter he had written, and Prince William accepted it with an expression that mixed surprise, pride, and concern. As he read, Hayes watched the prince's face carefully, noting the slight tightening around his eyes and the way his jaw set when he reached certain passages. "These are serious allegations, George," Prince William said finally, looking up from the letter. "You're suggesting that Sergeant Major Hayes is being unfairly targeted because of his son's professional activities. I'm suggesting that he deserves the opportunity to address these concerns directly before his career is ended by bureaucratic decision-making," George replied. "I'm also suggesting that we have a responsibility to ensure that loyal service is rewarded with fair treatment." Prince William set the letter down on his desk and looked directly at Hayes, for the first time since they had entered the room. "Sergeant Major Hayes, are you aware of the concerns that have been raised regarding your security clearance?" Hayes straightened to attention, falling back on decades of military training to find his voice. "I am now, Your Royal Highness. Prince George informed me of what he overheard during his mathematics lesson today. And what is your response to these concerns?" Hayes took a deep breath, understanding that his next words might determine not just his own future, but also whether Prince George's extraordinary intervention would be vindicated or dismissed as the misguided meddling of a child. "Your Royal Highness," Hayes began, "my son David is indeed working on an investigative story about defense contractors. He has contacted various sources in the course of his research, some of whom may have questionable backgrounds. However, David has never shared details of his work with me, nor have I ever provided him with any information that could compromise security protocols." Prince William listened intently, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. "The concern, as I understand it, is not about information you might have shared, but about the possibility that your family connections could be used to pressure or compromise you." "I understand that concern, sir," Hayes replied, "but I would respectfully point out that in 23 years of service, I have never been approached by anyone seeking to use my family relationships for improper purposes. Moreover, I believe my record demonstrates that my loyalty to this family transcends any other considerations." George stepped forward slightly, drawing his father's attention back to him. "Father, Sergeant Major Hayes has never asked for special treatment or consideration. He has simply done his job with complete dedication for over 2 decades. Doesn't that service earn him the right to a fair hearing rather than a summary dismissal?" Prince William was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between his son and the veteran Sergeant Major. Hayes could almost see the various factors being weighed in the prince's mind: security protocols, family loyalty, the precedent being set, and perhaps most importantly, the example being demonstrated to his eldest son about how leaders should treat those who serve them. "George," Prince William said finally, "you've presented a compelling argument for fairness and due process. However, you should understand that security decisions are not made lightly, and they often involve factors that cannot be shared publicly." "I understand that, Father," George replied, "but I also understand that good people sometimes get caught up in situations beyond their control. Surely there must be a way to address security concerns without destroying the career of someone who has proven his loyalty repeatedly." Prince William picked up the letter again and read through it once more, taking particular note of George's proposed solution. "You've suggested that Sergeant Major Hayes be given the opportunity to address these concerns directly. What exactly do you have in mind?" George's eyes brightened with hope, and Hayes felt his own heart rate increase, as he realized that Prince William was seriously considering his son's proposal rather than simply dismissing it out of hand. "I suggest that Sergeant Major Hayes be allowed to work with security officials to resolve the concerns about his son's activities," George said. "Perhaps there are ways to ensure that any potential risks are eliminated without ending his career. Perhaps David could be briefed on appropriate boundaries for his research, or additional monitoring procedures could be implemented temporarily." Prince William nodded slowly, and Hayes could see that the young prince's logical approach was having an impact on his father's thinking. These are reasonable suggestions, George, but implementing them would require cooperation from several different departments and agencies. Then perhaps, George said with quiet confidence, this is an opportunity to demonstrate that the royal family values loyalty and fairness as much as we value security. Prince William set down George's letter and walked to the tall windows that overlooked the castle's main courtyard. For several long moments he stood in silence, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that Hayes recognized from countless formal occasions. The afternoon light cast long shadows across the room, creating an atmosphere of gravitas that seemed appropriate for the momentous decision being contemplated. "Sergeant Major Hayes," Prince William said without turning around, "in your opinion, would your son be willing to cooperate with security officials to address their concerns about his research activities?" Hayes felt a surge of hope mixed with anxiety. The question suggested that Prince William was seriously considering George's proposal, but it also highlighted the complexity of the situation. David had always been fiercely independent, and the idea of government officials interfering with his journalistic work would likely be met with strong resistance. "Your Royal Highness," Hayes replied carefully, "my son is a principled man who believes strongly in the importance of investigative journalism. However, he is also someone who respects the law and understands the legitimate needs of national security. If the situation were explained to him properly, and if he understood that his father's career hung in the balance, I believe he would be willing to work within appropriate boundaries." Prince William turned back to face them, his expression thoughtful but unreadable. "George, do you understand the precedent you're asking me to set? If I intervene in this security decision, it could be seen as undermining the very protocols that exist to protect our family." George met his father's gaze steadily, showing no sign of backing down from his position. "Father, I understand that security is important, but I also understand that justice is important. If we allow good people to be treated unfairly because it's easier than addressing complex problems, what does that say about our values?" The young prince paused, seeming to gather his thoughts before continuing with what Hayes sensed would be his most important argument. "You've always taught me that being royal means serving others, not just being served by them," George said. "Sergeant Major Hayes has served us faithfully for 23 years. Now we have the opportunity to serve him by ensuring that he receives fair treatment. Isn't that what leadership means?" Hayes watched Prince William's face as he absorbed his son's words, and he could see the internal struggle taking place. The prince was clearly proud of George's moral reasoning and courage, but he was also grappling with the practical implications of what his son was asking. "The security advisors won't be pleased if I overrule their recommendation," Prince William said, though his tone suggested he was thinking aloud rather than rejecting the proposal outright. "Perhaps," George suggested quietly, "they might be pleased to discover that there's a way to address their concerns without destroying a good man's career. Perhaps they might even respect a decision that demonstrates that security and fairness can coexist." Prince William moved to his desk and picked up his phone. "Mrs. Thornbury, please get me Sir James Morrison on the line. Tell him it's urgent." He looked up at George and Hayes while waiting for the connection. "Sir James is the head of royal security. If we're going to do this, we need to do it properly." Hayes felt his knees nearly buckle with relief. Prince William wasn't guaranteeing anything, but he was taking action, which was more than Hayes had dared to hope for when this extraordinary afternoon began. The conversation with Sir James was brief, but intense. Prince William explained the situation in concise terms, making clear that he wanted the security concerns addressed through cooperation rather than dismissal. Hayes could hear Sir James's voice through the phone, though he couldn't make out the specific words. The tone, however, suggested surprise and some resistance to this unexpected intervention. "Sir James," Prince William said firmly, "I'm not asking you to compromise security. I'm asking you to find a solution that addresses your concerns while treating a loyal employee fairly. Surely that's not an unreasonable request." After ending the call, Prince William turned back to George and Hayes with an expression that mixed determination with uncertainty. "Sir James is going to review the case personally. He's agreed to meet with both of you tomorrow morning to discuss possible alternatives to immediate transfer." George's face lit up with a smile that transformed his serious expression into something radiantly hopeful. "Thank you, Father. This means, Prince William interrupted gently, that you've earned an opportunity for Sergeant Major Hayes to present his case. It doesn't guarantee any particular outcome, but it does ensure that the decision will be made with complete information and careful consideration. Hayes stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. Your Royal Highness, I cannot adequately express my gratitude for this opportunity. Whatever the outcome, the fact that you and Prince George were willing to intervene on my behalf means more than I can say. Prince William studied Hayes for a moment, then moved closer to both him and George. Sergeant Major Hayes, my son has demonstrated remarkable maturity and moral courage today. He's also demonstrated absolute faith in your character and loyalty. I hope that faith proves to be well-founded. It will be, sir, Hayes replied with quiet conviction. I give you my word. There is one more thing, Prince William continued, his tone becoming more serious. This intervention cannot become public knowledge. The security services require discretion, and public discussion of these matters could compromise ongoing investigations and protocols. George nodded immediately. Of course, Father. This remains completely confidential. And George, Prince William added, his voice taking on the tone of a father addressing his son, while I'm proud of your compassion and your courage today, I hope you understand that this kind of intervention should be reserved for exceptional circumstances. You cannot become personally involved in every personnel decision that affects the household staff. I understand, George replied solemnly, but I also hope you understand that some circumstances are too important to ignore, regardless of protocol or convenience. Prince William smiled for the first time since they had entered his office, and Hayes could see the pride and affection in his eyes as he looked at his eldest son. Yes, George, I think I'm beginning to understand that very well. As they prepared to leave the office, Prince William called Hayes back for a private word. George stepped into the corridor to wait, understanding that his father wanted to speak with the Sergeant Major alone. Sergeant Major Hayes, Prince William said quietly, my son has placed considerable faith in you today. He's also used his position as a member of this family to advocate for your cause. I hope you understand the responsibility that places on you. I do, Your Royal Highness, Hayes replied. Prince George has shown me what true leadership looks like. I will not disappoint either of you. Prince William extended his hand and Hayes shook it with a firm grip that conveyed mutual respect and understanding. See that you don't, Prince William said simply. My son's judgment of character is on the line, and I have great faith in his ability to recognize quality in people. As Hayes left the office and rejoined George in the corridor, he felt as though he had been given not just a second chance at his career, but also a profound lesson in courage, leadership, and the true meaning of service. Walking beside the young prince back toward his study, Hayes understood that this day had changed both of their lives in ways that would resonate for years to come. 6 months later, Sergeant Major William Hayes stood at his familiar post outside Prince George's study, but everything had changed. The morning sun cast the same long shadows across the manicured gardens, and his red tunic was pressed to the same exacting standards. But the man wearing it had been transformed by the events that had unfolded since that pivotal afternoon in autumn. The meeting with Sir James Morrison had proven to be even more productive than anyone had dared hope. The security chief, initially resistant to Prince William's intervention, had been impressed by Hayes's forthright answers and his willingness to cooperate fully with enhanced security protocols. More importantly, David Hayes had surprised everyone with his mature response to the situation. When confronted with the reality that his investigative work had inadvertently threatened his father's career, David had immediately volunteered to work with security officials to ensure that his research methods pose no risks to national security. He had even agreed to submit his articles for security review before publication, a compromise that protected both his journalistic integrity and the legitimate concerns of the intelligence services. The defense contractor story that David had been working on eventually won him a prestigious journalism award, but more importantly for Hayes, it had been published without compromising any sensitive information or creating security risks. The cooperation between David and the security services had actually strengthened both his reporting and the government's oversight of military contractors. As Hayes adjusted his position slightly, he reflected on the lessons learned during those tense months of uncertainty. The enhanced security protocols that had been implemented as part of his retention had actually improved overall security procedures for all royal protection staff. What had initially seemed like a crisis had ultimately led to positive changes that benefited everyone involved. The sound of approaching footsteps drew Hayes from his thoughts. Prince George emerged from his study, now 12 years old and noticeably taller than he had been 6 months earlier. The young prince had grown not just physically but in confidence and authority as well. The experience of successfully advocating for Hayes had clearly had a profound impact on his understanding of leadership and responsibility. "Good morning, Sergeant Major Hayes," George said with a warm smile that had become their customary greeting. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness," Hayes replied, noting the stack of books George was carrying. "Heavy reading today?" George hefted the books with a slight grimace. "Advanced Political Science and Constitutional History. Mr. Richardson says I need to understand the theoretical foundations of governance before I can appreciate the practical challenges." Hayes nodded approvingly. Since the events of the previous autumn, George's education had been expanded to include more advanced studies in leadership, ethics, and public service. The young prince had specifically requested these additions, demonstrating a seriousness about his future responsibilities that impressed everyone who worked with him. "Sergeant Major Hayes," George said, his tone becoming more serious, "I wanted to let you know that I received a letter from your son yesterday." Hayes felt a familiar flutter of concern, though it was much less intense than it would have been 6 months earlier. David's relationship with the royal family had evolved considerably since the security crisis, and he now occasionally corresponded with George about journalistic ethics and the role of the press in a democratic society. "David wrote to thank me for what happened last year," George continued, "but he also wanted me to understand something important about what you taught him during that difficult time." George paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "He said that watching you accept responsibility for the consequences of his actions, while still supporting his right to pursue his career, taught him more about integrity than any journalism course ever could." Hayes felt his throat tighten with emotion. The relationship between father and son had indeed grown stronger through the crisis, but he hadn't realized the depth of David's understanding of the sacrifices that had been involved. "David also mentioned that he's been offered a position with a major newspaper," George added with a smile. "Apparently, his willingness to work within security constraints while maintaining journalistic integrity has impressed several editors who value both courage and responsibility." "That's wonderful news," Hayes said, genuinely pleased by his son's success. "He's worked very hard to build his reputation." "He's learned from an excellent example," George replied quietly. "Speaking of which, I have something else to share with you." The young prince reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew an official-looking envelope bearing the royal seal. "This arrived this morning from my father's office." Hayes accepted the envelope with steady hands, though his heart rate increased as he opened it and began to read. The letter was brief but formal, informing him that he had been selected to receive the Royal Victorian Medal in recognition of his exceptional service and unwavering loyalty to the royal family. "Your Royal Highness," Hayes said, his voice barely above a whisper, "this is extraordinary. I never expected—" "You should have expected it," George interrupted gently. "Exceptional service deserves exceptional recognition. Besides, this honor isn't just about your years of duty. It's about your character under pressure and your willingness to stand up for what's right, even when the cost might be high." Hayes looked up from the letter to find George watching him with an expression of warm satisfaction. "Did you have anything to do with this recommendation?" George's smile became slightly mischievous. "Let's just say that when my father asked for my opinion about honors nominations, I had some very strong suggestions to offer." The two men stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. The crisis that had threatened to end Hayes's career had instead deepened his relationship with the royal family and strengthened his sense of purpose. "Sergeant Major Hayes," George said finally, "I want you to know that what happened last year changed me in ways I'm still discovering. You taught me that true leadership isn't about having power over others. It's about using whatever power you have to protect and serve people who deserve better." Hayes straightened to attention, not out of military protocol but out of genuine respect for the wisdom being demonstrated by someone so young. "Your Royal Highness, you taught me something equally important. You showed me that courage isn't just about facing physical danger. Sometimes the greatest courage is required to stand up for your principles when it would be easier to look the other way." George extended his hand, and Hayes shook it firmly, understanding that their relationship had evolved far beyond the traditional boundaries between royal family members and household staff. They had become something rarer and more valuable. They had become examples to each other of what it meant to serve with honor. "There's one more thing," George said, as they prepared to part ways. "My father has asked me to inform you that your security clearance review has been officially closed. All concerns have been resolved, and there are no restrictions on your continued service for as long as you choose to remain with us." Hayes felt a wave of relief and gratitude wash over him. The uncertainty that had shadowed the past 6 months was finally, completely behind him. "Thank you, Your Royal Highness, for everything." As George headed toward his constitutional history lesson, Hayes resumed his post with a renewed sense of purpose and pride. The red tunic felt different now, not just like a uniform, but like a symbol of honor earned through trial and validated by courage. Looking out at the gardens where groundskeepers continued their careful work, Hayes understood that he had learned something profound about the nature of service and loyalty. True loyalty wasn't blind obedience to authority. It was commitment to the highest ideals that authority should represent, and sometimes defending those ideals required the courage to stand up and fight, even when the odds seemed impossible. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting new shadows and illuminating new possibilities. Hayes stood straighter, his hand resting lightly on the Royal Medal citation in his pocket, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring, with the confidence that comes from knowing you have proven yourself worthy of the trust placed in you. In the distance, he could hear Prince George's voice as the young man began his lesson in constitutional history, and Hayes smiled, knowing that the future of the monarchy was in capable hands, hands that had already learned the most important lesson of all, that true power lies not in commanding others, but in lifting them up.